Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded event for International GCSE and the Edexcel Certificate in Biology. Feedback on June 2015. This recorded event provides feedback on the June 2015 examinations for International GCSE and the Edexcel Certificate in Biology. It uses examples of candidates' responses to questions on the papers 4BIO1B, 4BIO1BR, 4BIO2B, and 4BIO2BR. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy as we will refer to them during the session: the unit specifications, the question papers, the mark schemes, and the lead examiner's reports. The aims and objectives of this event are to receive feedback on the performance of candidates in the June 2015 examination series. Consider the variation of candidates' performance on different questions and possible reasons why. Look at the examiner's report. Address common issues and FAQs. General messages from this series of exams are: the examiners were impressed by the range of knowledge and understanding demonstrated by many of the candidates on the papers. Candidates were able to apply their knowledge and understanding, analysis and evaluation and investigative skills to some unfamiliar experiments or situations. Many centres have worked hard to carefully prepare candidates for the examination, and this was evident in the responses of many candidates. Very few candidates failed to attempt questions. There was little evidence of candidates running out of time on any paper. Most candidates were able to plan controlled experiments. Most candidates were able to plot appropriate graphs. Some candidates found applying their knowledge of biology to unfamiliar situations difficult. Some candidates found extended mini-essays challenging. Some candidates did not fully understand genetic engineering and/or cloning, including micropropagation. We will now look at some candidates' responses to some of the questions, in order to illustrate the range of student responses to different styles of question. We will also look at how students who did well on a particular question structured their answer, and why those who did less well did not often gain all the marks available. The examples are taken from a range of question styles and are from papers 4BIO, 1B, 1BR, 2B, and 2BR. This first example is this response from a candidate to question 2B Part 2 on paper 1BR. The question requires the candidate to explain why glucose is not present in the urine. This candidate gives a correct explanation and uses correct, accurate terminology. Marks were awarded for the idea of selective reabsorption of glucose back into the blood, a reference to the process of active transport, and a reference to the location in the nephron where this occurs, the proximal or first convoluted tubule. This candidate states all 3 mark points for a maximum of 2 marks. This question illustrates the importance of identifying command words, which in this case is explain. It also shows that the use of accurate scientific terminology is credited in many questions. Candidates who did less well often did not use correct vocabulary or gave vague answers. The example shown here would gain 1 mark. The candidate correctly refers to the process of selective reabsorption but does not expand the answer. No further explanation is offered, and the location of the reabsorption is stated as the kidney. This is too vague. It's important that candidates read questions carefully and look at the mark allocation. In this case, 2 marks. They should structure their answer to reflect the mark allocation and try to use accurate scientific terminology. On this question, successful candidates used correct scientific terminology, used a level of detail in keeping with the GCSE specification. On this question, less successful candidates did not use accurate scientific vocabulary, gave imprecise locations for the process of selective reabsorption, used detail that was not at a level required by GCSE biology. Activity 1. In this activity, you will look at a candidate's answer to question 5C from paper 2B and decide how many marks would be awarded. This question tests candidates' knowledge of hydrogen carbonate indicator. Candidates need to understand the use of hydrogen carbonate indicator for measuring carbon dioxide uptake or release. They should be aware of the colour changes that occur with increased carbon dioxide and reduced carbon dioxide. Use the mark scheme to decide how many marks this answer would gain. You may wish to pause the presentation at this point. This answer would gain 1 mark. The candidate correctly refers to the use of hydrogen carbonate indicator, gaining mark point 1. They correctly state that an increase of carbon dioxide would make the indicator turn yellow and a decrease would make the indicator turn purple. But contradict this by stating that the yellow colour would occur in the light. This is an example question and answer from paper 1BR. It asks candidates to describe how 2 structures labelled in a diagram, the ribs and diaphragm, help a person breathe in. Successful candidates listed 5 clear points. This candidate's response is an example of a response that gained all 5 marks. Correct technical terms such as contraction of the diaphragm are used, and the answer flows clearly. The marks gained are for the diaphragm contracting, the diaphragm moving downwards, the ribs moving upwards, the volume of the thorax increasing, and the pressure decreasing. Many candidates gave well-organised answers to this question that gained at least 4 of the 5 marks. There were several common reasons for candidates doing less well on this question, including not referring to contraction, only referring to one of the 2 structures, describing exhalation rather than inhalation, not understanding that an increase in volume results in a decrease in pressure. This example shows an answer that is not well structured. There is no reference to contraction of the diaphragm, although the candidate correctly states that the diaphragm moves downwards. The candidate correctly states that the rib cage expands, but gives no further information on the volume and pressure in the thorax. This answer would gain 2 marks. On this question, successful candidates used accurate detail, such as the diaphragm contracting, linked the actions of the diaphragm and rib cage to an increase in thorax volume, linked the increase in volume of the thorax to a decrease in pressure. On this question, less successful candidates did not use correct terms such as contraction, mixed up the actions of the diaphragm and rib cage in inhalation with exhalation, did not explain the changes in volume and pressure in the thorax, suggested that increased volume led to an increased pressure. Activity 2. This slide shows an example answer to question 2B on paper 2B. It asks candidates to compare the effects of increasing air temperature on sweat production when running and resting. It is an example of a question that requires candidates to look at 2 series of data and compare the 2. many candidates find comparing data difficult. Use the mark scheme to decide how many marks this answer would gain. You may wish to pause the presentation at this point. This answer would gain 1 mark for stating that both resting and running increase sweating. This answer does not actually compare sweat production when resting with running. The data in the question clearly shows a larger increase in sweat production when running. Candidates should look carefully at any data that they are presented with. On the mark scheme, 1 mark point is awarded for giving a correct numerical reference to the data. Both paper 4BIO1B and 4BIO1BR had a question requiring candidates to draw a bar graph. Most candidates have good graph drawing skills and are fully aware of the need to use linear scales, plot points accurately, add keys, and include units. Centres prepare candidates well and are using the acronym SLAP-UK to help candidates draw appropriate graphs. The acronym stands for S is for appropriate linear scales. L is for ruler-drawn lines that join points when line graphs are asked for. A is for axis labels. P is for correct plotting. U is for correct addition of units to axes, and K is for a key. Graphs should utilize over half the graph paper, and the independent variable should be placed on the x-axis. The exact way that marks are awarded for graphical questions will vary for each examination session and will depend on the type of graph and data being plotted. For this example, you should look carefully at the mark scheme for question 8A on paper 1B. The example shown here would gain all 6 marks. The candidate has used a linear scale that uses over half of the grid and has labelled both axes. Units are included on the y-axis. The plots are correct, and there is a key added. It is also notable that the candidate has taken time to ensure that all bars are drawn with a ruler. Where candidates did less well, it was typically due to not including labels and/or units on the axes, using a scale that resulted in a graph that did not fill half of the graph paper, not plotting points accurately enough. Candidates may be expected to use a truncated y-axis in order to make best use of the graph paper. Candidates should also be reminded to use a sharp pencil and ruler and take care when drawing the graph. This example would gain 4 marks for the scale, plotting, key, and labelling the x-axis. They have not labelled the y-axis or added units as per 100,000. On this question, successful candidates used linear scales, labelled both axes, included units, included a key, used a ruler to draw lines with a sharp pencil, used over half the grid. On this question, less successful candidates did not label axes, used non-linear scales, did not use units, did not use more than half the grid, did not take sufficient care over plotting, did not use sharp pencils and rulers when plotting. Activity 3. In this activity, you will mark a candidate's response to question 1F from the paper 2BR. This question required candidates to explain the sequence of events that occurs during a reflex arc and is an extended answer style question. Use the mark scheme to decide how many marks this answer would gain. You may wish to pause the presentation at this point. This answer would gain all 5 marks. It is a well-organised account of the sequence of events that occur during a reflex arc. the marks awarded are for references in the correct order to receptors, impulses, spinal cord, interneurons, motor neurons, and effectors. It is important that candidates give answers that show the correct sequence of events. This slide shows a candidate's answer to question 1G from paper 2B. The question is part of the comprehension question and requires candidates to explain the process of natural selection in the context of the information given about alligators. To gain full credit, candidates had to explain how survival of the alligators was due to possession of alligacin, then go on to say how this would lead to breeding and the passing on of the allele or gene for alligacin to the offspring. This example gains all 3 marks. The candidate clearly states that alligators with alligacin survive and reproduce for mark points 1 and 2. They also clearly state that the offspring inherit the gene for alligacin for mark point 3. This slide shows another candidate's answer to question 1G from paper 2B. This example only gains 1 mark and shows common mistakes made by candidates who did less well on this question. The candidate understands natural selection as the answer states that survival occurs, leading to breeding and passing on the gene. They have not, however, given an answer that is in the context of the question, instead giving a general description of natural selection. They state that natural selection is survival of the fittest, but do not link this to alligacin. 1 mark is gained for the correct reference to reproduction, but no mark is awarded for passing on a gene as it is not clear that it's the gene for alligacin. In natural selection questions, the best responses refer to the following points: genetic variation, mutation, survival advantage, reproduction, passing on the allele for the characteristic to the next generation. Candidates did best when their answer was in the context of the example given rather than a general description of the process of natural selection. On this question, successful candidates linked survival of the fittest to the context of the alligacin, linked passing on genes to offspring in the context of the alligacin gene. On this question, less successful candidates gave vague references to survival of the fittest rather than in the context of the question, referred to alligacin being passed on rather than the allele for alligacin, gave generic answers to genes being passed on rather than genes for alligacin. This slide shows an answer to question 3B part 1 on paper 2B from a candidate who did well. This question is a mini essay style question and required candidates to describe the process of micropropagation. The question has a mark allocation of 5, so candidates should try to describe at least 5 factual points in their answers. This example gained 5 marks for the references to explants, sterilized, agar, nutrients, and growth hormones. Candidates who did well demonstrated an excellent, detailed knowledge of the process of micropropagation, used accurate scientific language, and wrote carefully constructed answers. This slide shows an answer to question 3B part 1 on paper 2B from a candidate who did less well, although still gained 3 of the 5 marks. Marks were awarded for reference to sterile technique, nutrients, and sunlight. The candidate did not, however, use technical terms such as explant and callus and did not refer to the use of agar. Candidates who did less well generally did not use accurate language and gave vague descriptions of taking cuttings. In several cases, candidates gave descriptions of genetic modification. On this question, successful candidates used accurate, detailed language fully in keeping with the GCSE course of study, wrote well-organised answers. On this question, less successful candidates did not use detailed scientific language, only concentrated on one aspect of the answer, such as taking the explants. Did not give detail in keeping with the GCSE biology course. Confused micropropagation with genetic engineering. Activity 4. We have just looked at how well candidates did when answering extended answer questions. In this activity, you will mark a candidate's answer to question 7D on paper 4BIO 1B. You will need to use the mark scheme for this question. Decide how many marks would be awarded for this example. You may wish to pause the presentation at this point. This answer would gain 4 marks for correct references to restriction enzyme, vector, ligase, and recombinant DNA. No mark would be awarded for the reference to cutting DNA, as it did not specify the DNA for growth hormone. This answer shows how accurate use of technical language is essential to gain marks. Both Paper 1B and Paper 1BR included an experimental design question. Candidates are clearly well prepared by centres on how to answer this question and generally write controlled, valid plans that are written in continuous prose. Very few candidates gave answers that simply listed CORMS without any further explanation. Most candidates are using the idea of CORMS to construct their plans very effectively. The example answer on this slide to question 12 on the 1B paper gained 5 marks out of the 6 available. Marks were gained for C, comparing a group with garlic to one without garlic. R, carrying out repeats by using 10 in each group. M1, counting the number of mosquito bites. M2, using a correct time period of 1 day. S1, using people of the same gender or age. No O mark was given, as the candidate does not state that the mosquito species was kept the same and only one other variable was kept the same, so no S2 mark was awarded. Candidates who did less well on this question often wrote plans that were lacking in controls and so did not gain marks for O and S. Time periods were often not stated, so that mark M2 was not awarded. It is important that candidates write their answers in continuous prose. It is also important that candidates are careful to include the idea of repeat readings for reliability rather than repeats with different independent variables. The answer shown on this slide gained 4 marks for C, comparing a group with garlic and one without, R, using repeats, M1, counting numbers of mosquito bites, and M2, setting a suitable time period. No controls were suggested other than the same place, which is not specific enough. On this question, successful candidates used CORMS to organise their answers, wrote a full experimental plan using continuous prose, considered several control variables, gave specific detail in their answers, such as age of people, rather than the same people. On this question, less successful candidates did not write an experimental plan, but discussed the effects of mosquito bites. Did not include relevant control variables, with many listing as many possible variables they could think of, many of which were irrelevant. Gave vague answers, such as keep the environment the same, rather than the same temperature. Did not organise their answer around CORMS. Did not use continuous prose. Activity 5. We have just looked at how well candidates answered the experimental design questions. In this activity, you will mark a candidate's answer to this question. You will need to look at the mark scheme for question 12, paper 4BI 1B. Look at the candidate's response and use the mark scheme to decide how many marks would be awarded. You may wish to pause the presentation at this point. This answer would gain 6 marks. 10 people are used in each group, gaining the R mark. The people are of the same age and gender, gaining the S1 mark. One group has garlic and the other does not, gaining the C mark. The number of bites are counted, gaining the M1 mark. A time period is given, gaining the M2 mark. The same diet is used, gaining the S2 mark. The candidate also states that the same type of clothes are worn, but has already gained the maximum number of marks for S. There is no reference to the species or age of mosquitoes, so no O mark is present. Activity 5 continued. You have now marked an experimental design question from paper 1B. In this activity, you will mark a candidate's answer to the corresponding experimental design question for paper 1BR. You will need to look at the mark scheme for question 12, paper 4BIO 1BR. Look at the candidate's response and use the mark scheme to decide how many marks would be awarded. You may wish to pause the presentation at this point. This response would gain 4 marks. The C mark is awarded for the idea of comparing groups with or without vitamin D. This is not expressed well in this answer, and it is good practice for candidates to clearly explain how each group will be treated. The O mark is awarded for using children of the same age or gender. The R mark is awarded for the use of repeats. The M1 mark is awarded for the method of detecting rickets. No M2 mark is awarded as no time period is stated. No S marks are awarded as no clear control variables are stated. In summary, across all the papers it was found that students tended to perform well in graph plotting, mathematical calculations and experimental planning. Most candidates showed an understanding of human and plant physiology, ecology, human impact on the environment, cell biology, and membrane transport. Answers could have been improved by more confident usage of scientific terminology. Students tended to perform less well when tackling suggest questions, dealing with unfamiliar data, data analysis questions, and extended answer questions. Many candidates showed a lack of understanding of genetic engineering techniques, cloning, micropropagation of plants, natural selection when in the context of an unfamiliar example. Answers could have been improved by more attention to the detail required in questions about genetic and cloning technology, and more careful application of knowledge to unfamiliar examples.